All right, this is my second video about knots, and if you didn't see the first video, that's fine. They don't necessarily build on each other, but YouTube is full of good information on knots, and I was excited to do this, but I also wanted to do it in a helpful way and not just regurgitate what's already out there. And so these are longer format videos because I like to give the broader context to knots, the value of knots, why I chose one knot over another, and not just say, hey, have you ever heard of this knot? You should learn it. I think that there's enough half-hearted, shallow suggestions out in the world and on the internet, and so I guess I'm going to make a video about something I want it to be more comprehensive and a little deeper than just, here's a knot, you should learn it. So real quick, I want to go over all of the different attributes of knots and why a knot exists, why there's so many different knots. And so that will help you decide which of these knots is worth learning and which one isn't. Okay, so some knots are valuable because they're fast to untie. Some of them are valuable because they're fast to untie. Some of them jam on purpose, like if a rock climber falls, the knot will jam tighter and tighter and tighter. Then there are knots that do the opposite, where they never jam because you always want to be able to untie them. Some knots are designed to connect ropes of different diameters or one rope to another rope of a different diameter. Some are hitches, which means they attach to objects. Some are bends, which means they attach to other ropes. Some, and this is not always known, but some don't degrade the tensile strength of the rope. And what that means is this yellow rope is 275 paracord. That means it's designed to be able to hold 275 pounds, but not much more. As soon as I put a knot in it, this thing will not hold 275 pounds. The knot and the tight radius and the curves, it degrades the tensile strength of the rope. And so some knots are more complicated to tie while seemingly solving the same dilemma that a simpler knot might have, because it doesn't degrade the strength of the rope as much. And then the last reason, there may be more, but the last reason is that there are certain knots you can tie with a very small amount of rope. You might only have that much rope left at the end of something. Let's say you're putting up something as simple as a clothesline between two trees, but the trees are further apart than you thought they'd be, and you only have 6 inches of rope. Well, if you're good with knots, you might have a knot for that, and if you're bad and you need 15 wraps, you're going to run out. And then maybe the last thing would be something that's like very easy to tie, something you tie with your eyes closed, or something you can tie with one hand. That way you can tie it, if you have frozen hands or something like that. So this is one of the reasons that all these knots exist, because knots are all based around friction, and you can always add friction by just wrapping things more and more and more and more and more. And so that's why people get through life without learning knots, because you can basically always just wrap the rope around whatever you're doing repeatedly and basically get done what you want to get done. Okay, my favorite non-expensive rope is 275 paracord. This is 550 paracord, which everybody knows about, but this is overkill for the vast majority of situations. You do not need 550-pound tensile strength to lift up a bear bag in the wilderness, and you're paying for it in weight. And so I like 275 paracord. I've tried the thinner stuff, but I don't like the way the sheath feels. It's hard to handle with your fingers. It tangles up. There's something about 275 paracord. It holds knots well. It's not too slippery. It's a good size. You can still manipulate it with your fingers. It doesn't tangle that easily. And so I really like 275 paracord. It's cheaper than 550, and try it out if you haven't already. Okay, so in my last video, I suggested to you to learn 3 to 4 knots to put up a clothesline: a Siberian hitch, an Alpine butterfly, the Pharamond hitch, or the trucker's hitch. And I discouraged you from learning the taut line hitch, which I learned first because I think the Pharamond is superior. That actually is one other reason why you might learn a certain knot. So the taut line hitch and the Pharamond hitch basically do the same thing. The problem with the taut line hitch is, to tie it, you have to have access to the end. And that can be, sometimes you don't have access to the end, that's one thing. But here's the thing: if you have 100 feet of line and you're going between two trees that are 10 feet apart, you have to pull 90 feet of line through every time you make a turn in order to pull it through. Then you got to do it again and again. And so some knots can be tied without access to the end, and that makes them very valuable. And the Ferriman knot does that. Plus it's a quick release knot. So skip the taut line, go for the Ferriman, and that's all covered in my other video. Today I want to talk about 4 other knots that I think are useful. The first one is called a Zeppelin bend. And most people learn the square knot or the sheet bend instead. But I think the Zeppelin bend is superior for several reasons, and I'll tell you why. First of all, the sheet bend exists in part because it is designed to connect ropes of different diameters, which for the average Boy Scout or household owner or kid, that's pretty unlikely, and it's really not that valuable. The square knot is fine. There's nothing wrong with it, but the Zeppelin bend is very strong, doesn't jam. So the square knot jams, that's a problem. But the Zeppelin bend does not jam, and it degrades the strength of the rope very little, and it's very easy to tie. So I'll show you how to do it. On your left hand, you make a 6, and the tail of the 6 sits on top, closest to you. On the right hand, you make a 9, and the tail sits far away from you. You basically want the 9 tail away from you, so you can see the tail is on the underside, and on the 6, you want it for you. You put the 6 on the 9, and then you wrap the tails around. So the tail from the 6, which is on top, you wrap it down and up, and the tail that was down low from the 9, you bring up and around. Then you dress the knot, which means sort of getting all the slack out of it rather than just tugging. And that's called the Zeppelin bend. And it's elegant looking. I mean, it looks good. It's very strong. It doesn't degrade the rope. It's very easy to tie. And with the number 69, it's very easy to teach a child. Make a 6, make a 9, overlap them, right? The 9 goes on top, because it's bigger, that kind of thing. Or, excuse me, the 6 goes on top because the 6 comes first, 69, okay? So, Zeppelin bend, awesome knot, not as well known as the square or the sheet, but I think it's easy to remember, and overall it's a superior knot. Okay, the next knot I would learn is called the constrictor. I forgot to grab a couple things to constrict. So, constrictor knot is a knot that's used for bundling things together, is one application. And it's a very useful knot. It's great to teach kids because it's fun for kids to use it. So it's pretty easy. You start like this. Let me zoom out a little bit, sorry. Okay, so you start like this. So you go around, and then as you come over the top, you make an X, okay? So it's starting to look like a clove hitch. In fact, if you just went like this, it would be a clove hitch. But instead, you're just gonna move over this rope and make an X. Okay, so very similar to a clove hitch. It's almost identical to a clove hitch, but it's different. And then you pull it tight. Now, the constrictor knot constricts. This is a jamming knot. The whole purpose of this knot is to jam. So as you pull this, it will jam tighter and tighter and tighter. It can be very difficult to untie. In some cases, you have to cut it out, but it'll jam things together, whether that's sticks or drill bits or whatever. You can, of course, use this to attach to a tree, like a normal hitch or a branch, but normally you don't need this constriction, but in this case, it's great. This is also, because it's a jamming knot, you can shake it and things like that, and it basically won't work its way loose. In this case, because this is metal and they don't compress at all, and I didn't tie it very tight, they started to loosen. But the constrictor knot, very cool. Okay. The next knot, I actually don't know the name of, and I looked all over, I can't find it. I'm going to skip over the Canadian jam knot for a moment. I learned the bunt line hitch, which is a decent knot. It's basically a clove hitch. It's basically a clove hitch on the rope itself. It's fast and easy to tie, and it goes like this. And basically, it's designed for attaching to an object, and one of the benefits is that it pulls tight against the object, okay? This is a jamming knot. It can be difficult to untie. As you pull more and more and more, it jams against your carabiner. And that means that like this, you can hold it and it doesn't fall down like that. If you compare that to, let's just say something very simple, like a double overhand loop knot like this. Obviously, you can still use this to attach to an object, but only if you can open up the object. And now it's loose, and that may annoy you, or that may be problematic in your case because you want this loop to tighten up. Now, I wouldn't recommend using the bunt line. It's fast, it's easy. I take that back. It's a fine knot. If you want to use it, use it. What I don't like about it is it doesn't look that tidy, and that kind of annoys me because I'm a little bit OCD. So what I like doing instead, and I don't know the name of this knot, I'm sorry, but basically you pinch here, and you just wrap this. And you can wrap this as many times as you like, as many times as you want. And at the end, you tuck the tail in, and then you hang on to this, and you pull this tight. And I'm a bit OCD, and I just like the way this looks better. You can trim it. It looks a little neater to me. It looks a little tidier, but it basically works like a bunt line. And you just wrap that as many times as you want. If you want it real long, so be it. If you have super slippery rope, you might have to do it more. But this is a jamming knot. It can be difficult to untie. You may even have to cut it off. Now, one disadvantage to both of these knots is that if you're attaching to an oddly shaped object like this, let me show you. Because this knot relies on the jamming of the last little tail end between the rope and the object, if you have an odd shaped object, sometimes it won't jam properly. So I'll exaggerate the example. Let's say I wanted to attach it like this on the side. Because of this shape, it won't let the whole thing close in on itself. I hope you can see that. And so this little tail that's meant to get pinched doesn't get pinched. So you got to be careful with this knot. You got to be careful with both of these knots, because you got to be careful with this one a little bit more than the bunt line hitch, but the bunt line hitch can have this problem too. Maybe not on this object, but on a different object I've had it where it struggles to jam properly. So this one works the bunt line hitch works a little bit better for oddly shaped, but you can still see these windows, right? You can see those windows, and they can cause it to not be a jamming knot and to work itself loose. Okay, the last knot I'm going to tell you about really quick. I just discovered it, and I'm going to give credit to the guy I discovered it from, because I'd been looking for a knot like this for a long time. I found one called the parcel bend or the Packers knot. But this is a really cool knot. It's very simple. You just make an overhand knot like this, and you leave it kind of loose. Then you make another overhand knot here, and you tie it tight. Then you go to the other side of your rope, and you grab the end. Forget about the fact that there's something in it right now. That doesn't matter. And you put that through here, and you bring it back. Okay, so I'll tidy it up so you can see what we have going on here. It's almost like a noose. It's basically like a noose knot. Okay, so you have something like this, and then what happens is, this is kind of like a restrictor type knot. As you tighten this, it kind of has like a ratcheting mechanism, and it gets tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter. And it's easier to tie than the constrictor knot, but it's really good for constricting things. And what it basically does is it ties the rope under tension to an object. And you may be familiar with the trucker's hitch, which does something similar, but the trucker's hitch requires slack. You have to have the line floating in the air somewhere. And so if you want to tie down a package really well, or a cardboard box really well, a trucker's hitch, it can work, but it doesn't work really as well. So the Canadian jam knot, and I'm going to show you where I got that from in a minute. Now, you may be laughing at me or asking the main question, why have I not recommended that you learn a bowline? It's called the king of knots. It's the knot that everyone says you should learn first, blah, blah, blah. Here's my rationale. A bowline is a great knot. It's popular for a reason. I use it all the time. Here's why I don't recommend that it be so critical for you to learn right away. A bowline knot creates a loop at the end of the line, and it's strong, and it doesn't jam. So you can pull a train with this, and at the end of the day, it doesn't jam. It always is easily opened up, okay? It's a great knot. I use it all the time. Here's the reason why I don't think it should be the first knot that everybody learns. The reason I don't think everyone should learn it is because everyone already knows how to put a loop at the end of a line. You grab it like this and you do an overhand knot. It's faster, it's easier, it jams, but it doesn't jam so bad that you can't undo it. I'm pretty sure everyone has undone a knot like this before. Can you do it can you undo it as easily as a bowline? Absolutely not. But if you're using twine or cheap string, you just cut it and move on with your life. You only really have to worry about jamming and unjamming knots if you care about the rope. And so many times when we're tying knots and things, it's not in super expensive cord that you don't want to cut. It's in twine or cheap mason line. And so the bowline, this unjammable feature of the bowline, is true. It's great. And if you're dealing with, yachts and you're dealing with these massive, ropes, that's great. But if you're dealing with twine or cheap mason line or something like that, who cares? Just cut it out and move on with life. And so everyone knows how to put a loop in a line, and that's what a bowline does. And you have to also understand that a non-jamming knot is not always appreciated. So if this knot is attached to my kid's kayaks and it's rattling like that, I want it to jam, because an unjammable knot like the bowline can rattle itself loose. And so rather than learning a knot that does something you already know how to do, but slightly better, I would say put your knot learning effort into other knots that allow you to do something you don't know how to do and you don't have access to. So that's the reason the bowline is not on my first or second list, although it gets an honorable mention. And if you think that having a loop at the end of a line that doesn't jam is beneficial to you, then learn the bowline. But everyone knows how to do this, and this works almost all the time for so many applications, and I just don't think you should try and learn a new knot that does what you can already do. Okay, last thing, I'm gonna take you over the computer. So a couple resources. So this is the guy, the Bear Essentials. He's really great, and he does a bunch of knots, and that's where I learned the Canadian Jam knot. Animatedknots.com, they have all of these great animations for how knots work and what they're used for, and their applications. I really like it. The last thing, which is only a half recommendation, is this knot tying kit, Pro Knot. I owned this card. That's where I learned the first 15 knots that I committed to memory before going to Alaska on a backpacking trip. The only thing I don't like about this, there's a couple knots in there that are not good, like the sheep shank. And there's a couple knots in here that you just really don't need as a normal person. Like you don't know how to, you don't need to, you don't need to know how to build like a sling to, lower yourself to safety. And so there's some great knots in here, but then there's also some ones that you just don't need. And if you're buying this, that's because you don't know that much about knots, which is fine. And you need to learn something about knots, and you don't need to learn a bunch of knots that you're not going to use. And so there's just a bunch in here, I think, that are not worth it, but there's a bunch in there that are good. So if you know how to pick out which of these 23 are worth learning, and you want to have this little laminated card in your pocket at all times, it's great. And I used to have it. You just got to be a good editor and know which ones to take and which ones not to. All right. I hope that was interesting for someone. We're 18 minutes deep on a knot video, but again, I wanted to bring something to the YouTube world that I thought wasn't there, something more comprehensive and not just, something like this. Again, my issue with this is this guy's a wilderness guy, camping guy, bushcraft guy. You might be into sailing. You might be into doing cargo stuff. I mean, I don't know what you're into, and so only you can decide which knots are the best. And so they don't do that good of a job explaining how to choose between the different knots that are useful for you. So I hope you like this. If you didn't, I understand. It's long and lengthy with bad editing. Give it a thumbs down so that I know. Go check out this guy instead, the Bear Essentials. And in the meantime, have a great day.